Okay, welcome back. Let's continue where we left off and turn our attention to the White House over this same period of time. So, just before that first Nixon speech on the 20th of April, where he announced the troop withdrawal in Vietnam, and we will take it up until the delivery of his second speech 10 days later. It's also worth just quickly explaining some of the, procedures, the methods that the Nixon Whitehouse employed in order to make sure decisions and carry out the policies that they wanted to. So first things first, as we know, Nixon gets to the White House having previously been a vice president under Eisenhower, then losing a tight election to Kennedy in 1960, and then 9 years later he was back in, this time in the big chair. Each administration sort of has their own way of internally arriving at decisions, and Nixon and Kissinger had decided to revitalize the use of the National Security Council, a forum for discussing critical national security issues. In 1970, this meant you get together the President, Vice President Spiro Agnew, Secretary of State, which was William Rogers, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, and the National Security Advisor, which was Henry Kissinger. They get together, get briefed on a topic, then deliver a decision. Now, Kissinger played a central role in these meetings, and the reason they had set it up this way was because it bypassed the traditional interdepartmental process, which they felt bogged down everything and led to delays and conflicting opinions between agencies like the State Department, Defense Department, and the CIA, things like that. What this meant was that there was actually a very small amount of key decision makers, with limited input from other officials. And in terms of national security or foreign policy, Kissinger became the primary advisor to Nixon. They really had a lot of control and exercised it often in these high-stakes areas. And in practice, often this meant that the National Security Council meetings, which, was supposed to be the forum that things were discussed in, was almost like a put-on. Like Nixon and Kissinger would have already come to a decision, and then the National Security Council was called to work on something to keep them busy, essentially. But the decision itself had already been made by these two. This led to a lot of secrecy in the White House. There was an advisor that joined, I think in 1972, an economics guy who had worked with Kennedy and Johnson, Harold Malmgren, and he was told when he joined, careful what you say. Everything's being taped in here. And a lot of that had to do with his chief of staff, Haldeman, but it was okayed by Nixon and Kissinger from what I've read. He was quite partial to listening in on people, seeing if there was any gossip he could use to his advantage. And the tapes thing, well, many of you already know where that will end up. But overall, I think you can boil it down to Kissinger's highly influential role, the secrecy and almost self-deception that was the kind of culture of the Nixon administration, as well as their willingness to bend and even break the rules, disregard the bureaucracy and execute the strategies they felt were appropriate. Some examples we've already mentioned. Kissinger having secret peace talks with Lee Duc-tho, the secret Operation Menu bombings. Kissinger and Nixon will secretly arrange to set up the meetings that will eventually normalize Chinese and US relations. Anyway, I just feel it's good to have that in mind if you don't know about how Nixon would do stuff, or the role of Kissinger, and it will help explain this pretty hectic period. Now, somewhat unexpectedly, or not, I suppose it's one of those things where people who affect history have, personalities, they have certain qualities and unique attributes. So one of those attributes for Richard Nixon is that he didn't mind a drink. Apparently he didn't drink a very large amount, but could become visibly and audibly inebriated from just a few martinis or wines or maybe a bit of scotch. He would often drink at night, which was the style at the time. But this kind of gets mentioned in a lot of the sources, so let's pop that into our picture of what's happening and how these decisions are getting made over this hectic 10-day period. But also, and I'm not sure if I've ever seen something like this have a tangible effect on history, but in April 1970, a film was released starring George C. Scott, who I share with many people a great love for his acting, love him in Dr. Strangelove, and perhaps the lesser seen third Exorcist movie, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's really good return to form for that franchise. But in this movie, Scott plays the brash, brilliant General Patton, who oversaw many great victories in the Second World War. A news report from the 40s was helpful enough to encapsulate the man in just a few words for me. Quote, "It didn't hurt America to have a general so bold that he was dangerous." So I'm not sure if Nixon saw it at the cinema the first time, or maybe if you're president, these are part of the lesser known perks you might have available. But given that it just came out in April, for whatever reason, he'd also had access to the film at the White House and had basically been watching it on repeat, constantly inviting other members of staff to come in for screenings, and who doesn't enjoy a little drink when watching a movie with, explosions in? The movie is great. General Patton is portrayed brilliantly, but it's not to say he isn't, kind of a dick. It's sort of part of the great big personality he had. He's a military genius. He's ruthless, patriotic, egotistic. The movie opens with this absolutely stunning 6-minute monologue with George C. Scott alone on stage, standing in front of a giant American flag, which fills the whole screen. I can't not play you a little bit just to set the tone here.
Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. My God, I actually pity those poor bastards we're going up against. By God, I do. We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel. Now, some of you boys, I know, are wondering whether or not you'll chicken out under fire. Don't worry about it. I can assure you that you will all do your duty. The Nazis are the enemy. Wade into them. Spill their blood. Shoot them in the belly. When you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do.
I've finally been able to visit America a couple of times over the last few years, and I have a feeling that speech might still get some people fired up. Go back 55 years, and one of those people was the president. A few sources make connections between the misunderstood genius of Patton, who knew he could get the results even if people couldn't see what he could, the unconventional but visionary personality. And perhaps even you, my dear listener, can recall a time when you watched a film and really wanted to be like the character on screen, whether that's Luke Skywalker, Clarice Starling, or Special Agent Dale Cooper. Patton made defiance look like heroism. So Nixon is on repeat viewings of this 3-hour movie during this crucial period of time. And while it can't be pointed to precisely as this overbearing influence, it comes up a lot in the sources, perhaps as one of those interesting things to include, which is why I'm doing it too. But in whatever deterministic universe of possibilities that occurred, Patton seems to have played a minor part, which is wild. Anyway, so another pretty wild overlap here is another historical event which was put to the silver screen. Only difference is that the event itself was happening then and not the movie, Apollo 13. This crisis in space, aside from taking up a fair bit of attention of the president in the week, on the 18th, the day after the astronauts had safely been scooped up in the Pacific Ocean, he went out to Hawaii to meet with them. It was there that he also met with the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Forces in the Pacific, Admiral John McCain, the father of the late Senator John McCain, who back then was still a POW in North Vietnam. But his father remembered almost like a Popeye the Sailor kind of guy. Very impressive, very staunch, anti-communist. Here's a little clip of him speaking about leadership in the 60s just to give you a sort of taste of what he was like.
What would you say about the importance of leadership in the Navy?
As with every other profession in life, leadership is the single most important factor as far as achievement, success, and the completion of a job to be done. You can buy many things in life, but you cannot buy leadership. And there are certain simple rules that go with leadership. As you and I know, there have been great volumes written on this subject, and it's very rare in my naval career that I have ever heard it expressed simply, but the fundamental fact of leadership rotates around the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
If you didn't imagine a cigar in his hand, you certainly should have been. Anyway, Nixon meets with him, and McCain gives him one of, what I can gather, was basically his signature talk. He's always got big maps handy that show the world and these big scary red arrows or claws coming down from China or the Soviet Union. And he's got Cambodia all stained in red, the claws coming for Phnom Penh. McCain, I would say in a way that wouldn't have been too dissimilar from how George C. Scott did the speeches in Patton. You know, someone that can really say bastards with that gravelly tone that you can't help but nod to and say yes. McCain very well impresses upon Nixon that Cambodia was in trouble, that Saigon had to have its western flank protected, that Lon Nol should be an ally for the Americans, and that he needed more than just some old rifles. He needed an assault on those sanctuaries of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Nixon was impressed, and after he'd met with the astronauts, he returned to Washington with an imperative. With Nixon back in the White House and delivering that first speech we spoke about earlier in the episode on April 20, we have to consider the information they had on hand at this time and recall the objectives that were their priority in order to explain what would happen next. It was precisely around the day that Nixon made this speech with, it should be mentioned, an optimistic tone around getting troops out, but also a few poignant ifs placed throughout, like if they don't stop doing this, we might have to do something. That was around the same day that fighting came close to Phnom Penh, around the same time that Lon Nol publicly asked for help. And the deliberations about what that help might look like, as well as the consequences of not helping, this is the topic of discussion. It is apparent that they were receiving different evidence and interpretations of that evidence from the relevant bodies, the military, CIA, that the communists were building up strength in the sanctuaries in eastern Cambodia for an offensive on Saigon. Other captured documents seem to suggest that the communists expected a US invasion into Cambodia to break up the sanctuaries, whereas another stated that the Vietnamese thought that the US would only indirectly support Lon Nol. Nixon, as well as Kissinger, were also considering the actions that might directly affect the negotiations for peace that were going on with the North Vietnamese. They felt that their interlocutor, Le Duc Tho, and the communists generally understood military might as an important aspect of diplomacy, not just diplomacy by itself. Prior to the coup against Sihanouk, there had already been plans that had come from the military of a land-based incursion into Cambodia to deal with these sanctuaries. And we touched on that in the episode about the Operation Menu bombings, where it was one of many options. On April 22nd, Nixon was awake at 5 a.m. He was dictating a memo to Kissinger, a bold move that would signal support to Lon Nol. After all, this was the first government in Cambodia for 25 years that, in his words, had the guts to be pro-Western, and it was about to fall. Kissinger is also instructed to make sure the Soviets know that if Phnom Penh was attacked, there'd be a reaction. That day, a National Security Council meeting was called. At this meeting, which included, as we mentioned before, the Secretary of State William Rogers, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, and Kissinger, and representatives from the military and everyone important, the main realization of that meeting is that regardless of the different interpretations of what might happen, the main American objective of Vietnamization was under threat if this continues. The response? Well, essentially it boiled down to three options. They could watch and wait, They could arrange for South Vietnamese troops to go in and attack a limited number of communist sanctuaries across the border. Or lastly, that they send in American troops as well. This was all centered around the part of the map called the Fishhook, the area of Cambodia that juts right into South Vietnam and towards Saigon. This was where the Operation Menu bombings had first began, and as we said, looking for that Cosvin base of operations they thought was located somewhere there. Now, there's another area called the Parrot's Beak. That's a little up north on the map and another kind of protuberance, good word, on the map that juts out of Cambodia. That was also, they knew there was plenty of sanctuaries in that area too, but for the moment they thought, okay, we'll just focus on the Fishhook. The Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State both think that the first option, watch and wait, is the move. Kissinger thinks option 2, get the South Vietnamese involved in the Fishhook with US air support, is the move. Nixon agrees. But it's at this point that Spiro Agnew, the Vice President, he speaks up. He says something like, "This is all pussyfooting. If the sanctuaries need clearing out, then we should get in there and do it." Now, Nixon, fresh from chats with McCain, fired up on Patton, he's thinking, whoa. The Vice President isn't going to have the idea that's more ballsy than my idea. He starts thinking, yeah, why not put US troops in? If something is worth doing, it's worth doing well. In the next few days, it seemed that Nixon became more and more agitated. Kissinger is recorded in Walter Isaacson's biography saying, "Our peerless leader has flipped out." Nixon went to Camp David with a friend of his, and apparently they enjoyed a martini or two, as Kissinger and the gang worked on the plan of getting the South Vietnamese to attack the Cambodian sanctuaries, and this was planned to start on the 26th of April. Operation Shoemaker. Then, Nixon began to urge that the option of US troops should also be taken up. Another National Security Council meeting was scheduled, but Nixon postponed it. Recall that these meetings were often just a bit of a put-on, given that Kissinger and Nixon would have decided the outcome ahead of time. But in this scenario, with Kissinger backing Nixon and going against the Secretary of State, Nixon's putting a lot of faith in him as well. And he called from Camp David, drunk, in the same way that you might receive a call from two friends who are having a bigger night than you are, and they're out saying a lot of shouting, they're slurring their words, they're swearing, and then someone passes the phone like, "Hey, so-and-so's got something to say." And in this situation, the phone was passed, and Nixon's mate, Rebozo, says, "The president wants you to know, Henry, that if this doesn't work, it'll be your ass." So you can imagine the kinds of discussions that were being had at Camp David. Over the next few days, the plan developed further. For Kissinger's staff, many of them had clear objections. They felt that this action was against the Nixon doctrine, to which he's recalled to have said, "We wrote the damn doctrine, we can change it." Others said that it was expanding the war. The response was that we have to be tough on this. All in all, it kind of fit in with the madman theory that Nixon had explored the year before, projecting this image of someone in charge who would do anything and could shock his enemies into submission or into action at the negotiation table. Interestingly, and this almost plays into this culture of the Nixon Whitehouse, where numerous aides would listen in to different phone calls to provide notes and things like that, and with Nixon calling drunk every now and again and making bold suggestions. Sometimes Kissinger would use this as a kind of boost to his own already powerful status, suggesting like, "Oh, well, you've heard this guy on the phone. You know he's crazy. Just trust me and do this or that." In terms of the Cambodia campaign, however, Kissinger was on the same page with Nixon. He thought there was little difference between border skirmishes or an invasion, and that just a small incursion of South Vietnamese wouldn't do anything. His staff that opposed this simply couldn't come up with a defense of how the plan to achieve Vietnamization could succeed without a massive clear-out of the sanctuaries in Cambodia. Soon after, Kissinger joined Nixon at Camp David. It seems the martinis were still getting dished out, and Nixon had taken the bold and brash to new levels. He was considering even more things than US troops in Cambodia, perhaps mining Haiphong Harbour. Kissinger deflected this like trying to calm down a drunken friend at a party. "We already have enough on our plate." Nixon has another screening of Patton, invites the staff. Kissinger recalled being able to escape for an hour in the middle of the movie so he could plan for the next National Security Council meeting. If they were going to invade a country, the Secretary of State and Defense had to be consulted. And this is a primary example of the National Security Council meetings being, a foregone conclusion. Nixon and Kissinger already had their plan. They knew what they were going to do. It was only after that meeting that Laird and Rogers found out about the American troops being sent into the fishhook. They had objections which were ignored, the biggest being that the mission was being framed, just like the bombing had been, as an attempt to destroy Kosvin. By this time, many within the intelligence services had deduced that it wasn't a place, that it was mobile, that any attempt to find it and destroy it would be futile and embarrassing. Nixon's having none of this by this point. He's juiced up on Patton rewatches. He wanted to go for the big play, for all the marbles. Interestingly, all these things had been considered by the previous administration, even half-heartedly engaged. But Nixon was going to go for it big time. Just like the menu bombings had greatly expanded upon what had been done prior, so too would this invasion. And invasion is an interesting word here. The White House will refer to it officially as an incursion. And aside from the obvious attempt to rid themselves of the connotations of the word invasion, which might bring to mind, in a modern context, the German invasion of Poland, the USA invading Afghanistan or Iraq, or more recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Like, an invasion, definition-wise, this wasn't exactly in the same camp. If they were invading Cambodia, it was, intent-wise, to help the Cambodian government. And it was an invasion where they were not fighting Cambodians. So I can see why they didn't want to use the word invasion, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think and whatever you want to call it. But in any case, I believe Nixon was of the thought process that many of us might go over. However, in completely different circumstances. Where it's like, I don't know, you might eat one cookie and then figure you might as well eat the whole box. Once you cross the line, it's hard not to say, okay, well, we're here now, might as well do the whole job. It's like that speech from Patton. Americans play to win. Nixon didn't want General Creighton Abrams to simply make a routine announcement of the incursion either. No, Nixon wanted this for himself. Apparently he stayed up until 4 a.m. on the 30th of April writing this speech. Maybe with a drink or two, I don't know. The final copy received very little notes or changes from advisors. It was delivered that night, and it serves as a fascinating primary source for Nixon himself, as well as the history of the wars in Indochina. Let's listen to some highlights and discuss the outcome.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. 10 days ago, in my report to the nation on Vietnam, I announced the decision to withdraw an additional 150,000 Americans from Vietnam over the next year. And at that time, I warned that if I concluded that increased enemy activity in any of these areas endangered the lives of Americans remaining in Vietnam, I would not hesitate to take strong and effective measures to deal with that situation. Despite that warning, North Vietnam has increased its military aggression in all these areas, and particularly in Cambodia. To protect our men who are in Vietnam and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action. These communist-occupied territories contain major base camps, training sites, logistics facilities, weapons and ammunition factories, airstrips, and prisoner-of-war compounds. And for 5 years, neither the United States nor South Vietnam has moved against these enemy sanctuaries because we did not wish to violate the territory of a neutral nation. Even after the Vietnamese communists began to expand these sanctuaries 4 weeks ago, we counseled patience to our South Vietnamese allies and imposed restraints on our own commanders. In contrast to our policy, the enemy in the past 2 weeks has stepped up his guerrilla actions, and he is concentrating his main forces in these sanctuaries that you see on this map, where they are building up to launch massive attacks on our forces and those of South Vietnam. North Vietnam, in the last 2 weeks, has stripped away all pretense of respecting the sovereignty or the neutrality of Cambodia. Thousands of their soldiers are invading the country from the sanctuaries. They are encircling the capital of Phnom Penh. Coming from these sanctuaries, as you see here, they have moved into Cambodia and are encircling the capital. Cambodia, as a result of this, has sent out a call to the United States, to a number of other nations for assistance. Because if this enemy effort succeeds, Cambodia would become a vast enemy staging area and a springboard for attacks on South Vietnam along 600 miles of frontier, a refuge where enemy troops could return from combat without fear of retaliation. This is the decision I have made. In cooperation with the armed forces of South Vietnam, attacks are being launched this week to clean out major enemy sanctuaries on the Cambodian-Vietnam border. Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. The areas in which these attacks will be launched are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw. And now let me give you the reasons for my decision. A majority of the American people, a majority of you listening to me, are for the withdrawal of our forces from Vietnam. The action I have taken tonight is indispensable for the continuing success of that withdrawal program. We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace we all desire. We have made, we will continue to make every possible effort to end this war through negotiation at the conference table rather than through more fighting in the battlefield. If the enemy response to our most conciliatory offers for peaceful negotiation continues to be to increase its attacks and humiliate and defeat us, we shall react accordingly. My fellow Americans, we live in an age of anarchy, both abroad and at home. We see mindless attacks on all the great institutions which have been created by free civilizations in the last 500 years. Even here in the United States, great universities are being systematically destroyed. Small nations all over the world find themselves under attack from within and from without. If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world. The opportunity for 150,000 Americans to come home in the next 12 months is involved. The future of 18 million people in South Vietnam and 7 million people in Cambodia is involved. The possibility of winning a just peace in Vietnam and in the Pacific is at stake. Thank you. Good night.
Okay, sorry if that went a little long, but it is a very important speech, and I believe it's worth listening to as much of it as possible. It went for about 22 minutes originally, but I've cut it down a fair bit there for you. Now, some of the stuff I cut out had to do with things we've already discussed in the lead up to this, and I kept it in originally, but it was sort of a tangent at the end where Nixon brings up prior presidents who had made significant decisions that affected wars. Wilson in World War I, Roosevelt in World War II, Eisenhower in Korea, and Kennedy in Cuba. And he is at pains to say, look, the decision he's making isn't as big of a deal as those, but he says that those decisions by those presidents were not surrounded by this cloud of doubt and defeat from, quote, the most widely known opinion leaders in the nation. He mentions a particular Republican senator that has questioned whether this action will rule him out for re-election, which is something we've touched a lot on in the past. This baton of the Vietnam problem, and how so much of it has been influenced by domestic issues, and at the core of that, a 4-year election cycle. And that kind of leads us to the big theme of the speech, isn't it? It's that line, America can't act like a pitiful, helpless giant, which is a reflection of the president's administration as well, which is why, on numerous occasions since the early 1960s, presidents have had to, look tough on communism, and Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia have been where that exchange of prestige has taken place, which is, it's sort of beyond me being able to advance the conversation on that topic by condemning that as good or bad. It simply was, or is, a fact of how the bipolar world of the Cold War played out. If you want to criticize one side or the other for their role, that's totally fine, but you'd be aware that it's much for muchness. The Soviet actions in Berlin or invasions of Hungary or Afghanistan come to mind. But I also understand that despite this being something that happened 55 years ago, it still carries a lot of weight and emotion. And it's going to be interesting to see how the contemporary politics and historical events of today are considered by the people still alive in the year 2080. And this idea actually kept me up at night not long ago. I suppose it was a little bit along the lines of those memes of someone saying something along the lines of, we're much closer to the year 2050 than we are to the year 1980, which, I wasn't even alive in 1980, but it does tend to make the mind feel a little strange. In any case, how long ago this was, I think should allow for some room for us to look at these events with perhaps even a self-imposed degree of neutrality and objectivity, and look at the history for what it was rather than through a partisan lens. Or that's at least what I'm trying to attempt to do, to present to you, and you can decide how you feel either way. Because, this was a contentious issue, and it affected a very large number of people. But it may be that the decision itself, it was a catch-22, that there was no correct decision to take at that point in time. Or perhaps there was, but it was impossible to know or to make. Anyway, the speech. So this was the announcement of the incursion, as the White House will call it. Nixon frames the problem, and you know what the problem is by now, but he also quite interestingly gives multiple reasons for why this action was being taken. The need to protect Vietnamization, the protection of Cambodia, the intransigence of the communist Vietnamese, and yes, the need to protect the image of America in the Cold War for her own prestige as well as to provide confidence in their ability to protect their allies. Now, on all of those issues, he's not wrong. He does say it's not an invasion of Cambodia, and as we mentioned, I think he is within his rights to claim that what this was, at least definition-wise, not what you might describe as an invasion. He says they weren't going to occupy, which was also true. This was a short-term thing. And he says the North Vietnamese were encircling Phnom Penh, which was also true. And perhaps the biggest reason he gave was also true, that the majority of Americans wanted out of Vietnam. And this problem in Cambodia needed fixing in order to allow for that. Now, that is not to say that it was this great noble thing and that Nixon was the paragon of virtue here either. You, my dear listener, may have noticed he had said that for the last 5 years, the United States had scrupulously respected Cambodia's neutrality, that neither they nor the South Vietnamese had moved against the sanctuaries because they did not wish to violate the territory of a neutral country. Well, we both know, as did Nixon, that there had been multiple instances in which that territorial boundary had been breached, as organised and actioned by he and Kissinger in the shape of the Operation Menu bombings, which, by the way, by this point, was still continuing but under a different name, as Operation Patio, but still being done in the same way. Choose a target where the sanctuaries were supposed to be in Cambodia, but put it up on the official bombing run that it was being dropped in Vietnam. All hush hush. The other glaring thing that was occurring is that, and this is something Shawcross hones in on, is that Congress was not consulted before this major action. Now, I get what he's saying, I get that argument, but I think there is a counter to that, which is, he fails to mention that Congress hadn't officially declared war in a long time, and wouldn't for a long time hence, not that he was to know that when he was writing the book. Shawcross also points out that despite Nixon saying that he had disregarded political issues in pursuing the Cambodian incursion, well, there were some domestic concerns that Nixon was attempting to maneuver via this, tough display. Something to do with the Senate rejecting his picks for the Supreme Court that month in April, and Shawcross wrote, quote, "His distress did not abate during the month, and it was apparent to members of the National Security Council staff that, whatever else he thought of Cambodia, Nixon also saw it as a chance of restoring his slighted authority," end quote. And again, I agree, he has a point, but it is one that I think is slightly mitigated by this being a bit of a theme in regards to Indochina for the last 3 presidents. Domestic concerns, however depressing it may be, did have a role in getting involved in the region. Recall Kennedy needing to look tough on communism, needing a win after the Bay of Pigs, the crisis in Laos. Similarly, Johnson had concerns on escalating the war, and now Nixon whilst trying to get out of it. But I am convinced by those writers like Shawcross, like Walter Isaacson in his biography of Kissinger, that it was even just the way that Nixon went about this announcement of the incursion itself that was wrong-headed and will in and of itself have detrimental effects. Firstly, he makes it a big deal. As we said earlier, he could have handed this over to General Abrams in Saigon, and this could have been made into a more routine exercise. Something along the lines of, yes, today I would like to announce we are performing a minor incursion with the South Vietnamese forces to clear out sanctuaries in these areas of the border of Cambodia, following the appeal of the new Cambodian government. We will be withdrawing at the end of June once we have done so. Thank you, no more questions. That's goodbye. And that's sort of what could have been the case here. No fuss, no lies, no personal appeal to the American people, and not opening yourself up to the impression that it was all Nixon's idea. And from a critical angle, such as the anti-war movement in the universities he was saying were being systematically destroyed, he was really giving those people something to get motivated by, and they were already extremely motivated. I'm trying to think of a good contemporary example to compare it to, but all I could do was maybe, the celebrity that comes out on social media, they're trying to make a video and they make a big fuss in one of their public apologies, rather than just letting a rumor exist or letting things pass. They get out there and they try and make a big excuse or make a big deal about it, and then everyone starts talking about the apology video because they got the apology video wrong. They created their own story out of a story they didn't want to really exist. Isaacson, in his biography of Kissinger, he does describe it along those lines. Like, because Nixon made it a big thing, it became a big thing. And it's hard to say that the announcement being made like that had any potential benefit, but it definitely had lots of negative outcomes. And that perhaps, the president making it personal, perhaps wanting to emulate Patton from the movies he kept watching, these things influenced a bad decision. And, we all make bad decisions some days, but what makes a bad decision even worse is when there's other people in the room saying, no, you should make this other decision instead. And it's a lot worse when you say, no, I'm going to do it this way. You really open yourself up for more criticism when you do that, don't you? The speech itself was explosive. And I think it's fair to say it directly can be linked to the level of student activism at somewhere like Kent State, where on the 4th of May, the National Guard actually opened fire on the students that were protesting, killing 4 and injuring 9. And if you look, just look at the Wikipedia page for this. It's horrible. You've got Alison Beth Krause, fatal left chest wound, dead on arrival. Glenn Miller, shot through the mouth, killed instantly. William Knox Schrader, fatal chest wound. Sandra Lee Shower, fatal neck wound. These are American students in America being shot by American guards. And this will produce one of the most haunting photos of the Vietnam War in the process. Now, another issue with this speech is that he was told not to expressly mention Cosvin as a base that they were trying to get. Because, some parts of the intelligence community knew that it wasn't a base per se. And if you're going to say you're going to find it, you'll look silly because you're not going to find it. And in the bigger picture, when it comes to those people in the room that were urging a more cautious approach, you've ignored that too. And from a critical point of view, you're widening the war. And that is, despite all of the fairly reasonable reasons that it was done, it still looks the way it looks. And a few members of Kissinger's staff resign in protest as a result. Another problem is that it is announced that it would be a short-term thing, which was necessary to appease all kinds of domestic criticism, but as a military tactic, well, if you tell the enemy that you're going to be withdrawing in a couple of months, it gives them room to say, okay, well, tell you what, how about we basically avoid you as much as possible during that time, and, once you're gone, we'll just go back to things as they were, right? Now, even with all of those negatives about the speech and the incursion generally in mind, I can't help but think this point made by Wilfred Diak makes a lot of sense as well. Quote, "The primary reason for the invasion, the one around which all others, including forestalling enemy threats to Vietnamization and the US withdrawal from Vietnam, revolved, was to prevent the fall of Cambodia. Washington had 2 outside choices: intervene directly or face a suddenly worsening political military situation. It was a catch-22 dilemma without a truly satisfactory solution." End quote. And I think despite all of the negatives that we just talked about, I think that is a fair way of examining this. And yet, even if the intentions were not insidious, as I think sometimes it is given a bit of an over-the-top valence of Nixon and Kissinger they just wanted to recklessly go and kill Cambodians. That's an oversimplification. Just like Nixon was drunk and watching Patton and decided to invade Cambodia. We've traced those 10 days and the decision-making process, and it wasn't quite that simple, was it? But their intentions, which matter, weren't divorced from the reality of the situation that Cambodia faced, nor their own interests. But as we all know, and especially for people in leadership positions, sometimes intent can be good, but consequences, unknown consequences, can be bad and can make that intent somewhat irrelevant. But we will talk about that later. Anyway, again, it is just one of those things where, I'll say this, I think it is often overly simplified, and it's just talked about this thing that just happened, but I've wanted to really go into detail here to explain to you how this decision was made, because it wasn't simple, but you can go around and around in circles about what you think about it. and I'm going to let you make up your own mind on what either you think should have been done or what you think you might have done given all of the options available, but regardless of that, let's move the story forward. Now, another surprising thing about the announcement of this incursion, or invasion, or the Cambodia Campaign in the American War in Vietnam, if you want to call it that, was that Lon Nol, whose plea this was addressing, had not been made aware of it ahead of time. But this was a bit of a mistake rather than a purposeful slight. As Wilfred Diak writes in Road to the Killing Fields, quote, "Ironically and embarrassingly, the US Embassy was one of the last to learn of the incursion because of White House secrecy and inadequate decoding equipment. Charge d'Affaires Lloyd Rivers heard the news over commercial radio as he was manually decoding a State Department instruction to inform Lon Nol." End quote. So that's not a great look, is it? But Henry Calm, who was in country, as we know from the last episode, and had gained quite a lot of access to both Lon Nol and his younger brother Lon Non, but he has an interesting and close perspective of this gaffe. The journalist had seen Lon Non on the evening of April 30th. He mentioned to him in passing that the American radio in Saigon had announced it would be transmitting an important speech on Indochina by President Nixon from Washington that evening. And with the time difference, it would be broadcast in the early morning on May 1st in Phnom Penh. Calm says that Lon Non was like, "Oh, that's interesting. Could you please listen and tell me what Nixon said?" And he mentioned this in the book. He says that this question was asked to him eagerly. And the journalist responded along the lines of, "Well, hold on, don't, you and your brother, the Prime Minister, have English speakers on your staff to do something like that?" And the answer was, quite incredibly, no, they didn't. So that is pretty wild, isn't it? That this government was going into this heated moment in April we've been talking about in this episode and last, and we've basically got no one around that could communicate in the language that was pretty important to what they wanted to do. Anyway, Calm says, "Wow, alright, yeah, I'll translate the speech and I'll give you a report, but in exchange for a meeting with the Prime Minister." Basically, he sets up almost, an exclusive interview in return. Calm says that he was in the hotel listening to the incursion speech the next morning when he was brought to see Lon Non in his office, and he's there flanked by 12 guys he called the Committee of Intellectuals. Now, when Calm told them what Nixon had announced, they broke out in applause and cheered. And as was the deal, Calm then headed to the Prime Minister's villa and waited to see Lon Nol. I'll quote the next section here from his book. "Just at that moment, an American embassy car delivered the charge d'affaires Lloyd Rivers. Sheaves of paper trailed from the jacket pocket of his white suit. They were an advanced summary of Nixon's text, cabled to the embassy from Washington. This important document was delivered to the embassy hours after it had arrived. In fact, the mailman brought it while the charge was listening to the speech at his residence. Even in times of emergency, no one manned Cambodia's central post office between 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning. The small, intentionally low-profile embassy, reopened less than a year earlier, did not have its own communication channels. Its coded messages were handled by the Australian embassy, and other traffic, like the Nixon text, was sent on the ordinary commercial channel received by the post office and delivered after the post office opened for business. I don't know whether Lon Nol received the first news of his country's invasion by the United States from his brother, who had learned it from me, or from the American charge." End quote. Now, one reading of that little story kind of gives a nice warm feeling, a sort of quaint, Cambodia kind of nostalgia. Obviously, that feeling is closely followed by one of deep foreboding. It reminds me of, in the last episode, we spoke about the government troops attempting to repel the communist advance at the town of Sang, and it was all just a little bit unserious, considering, the seriousness of the situation. So what was Lon Nol's reaction? Well, He was genuinely surprised, for starters. As we said, they had not been informed as a means of protecting the secret of the incursion, the surprise of it up until that point. And then he gets this last-minute, mistake. So there's overall a lack of an official heads-up before it actually happens. So that's not a great look. And at first, the Prime Minister is apprehensive. He'd wished that the weapons had just been made available to his government so that they could do this themselves, if they could. And it was clear to Nixon, and he basically mentioned it in the address, that the Cambodians weren't really capable of using the weapons anyway. And I would say on the whole that's probably the correct assessment. But very soon after, Lon Nol openly embraced what Nixon had declared, and at that time, this was already occurring. The South Vietnamese and American troops were already in Cambodia. And before we get to the shape of the incursion itself and its direct results, Calm also shares his thoughts on this interaction, which I think is compelling. Quote, "Whatever Lon Nol's reaction, he and his entourage had once again proved how remote they were from the harsh world in which they lived. However dire the emergency, and however high their hopes for American support, no one had bothered to listen to a Nixon speech, a declaration of crucial national interest, announced well in advance, that they could have tuned into on any ordinary radio." End quote. And these are just not great signs. The morning of May 1st, as Nixon's speech plays out via invisible radio waves across the region, an oxen calf bathes in a shallow ditch just off the side of one of the many reddish-brown mud and dirt roads that lay just across the border from South Vietnam and into Cambodia. Impressions of hooves and bicycle tracks and carts have repeatedly been pressed over each other into the softened earth. The horizon is very far and still able to be seen, with not one hill obscuring the view of green fields, grazing animals, punctuated by man-made right angles and straight lines of the occasional row of trees that divide farmland or rice paddy. In the sky, clouds sit at a variety of heights, some more pregnant than others with the growing relief from the end of the dry season. The grass has turned green, there are puddles with tadpoles swimming freely. A dike runs up the side of the road, meeting a shallow, thin canal of latte-coloured water. Behind, approaching from the direction of the border on the map, but one would hardly know it if they stood on this road where Vietnam ends and Cambodia begins, was a steadily growing sound, a rumble. And as it nears, what was just a rumble becomes a cacophony of engines, metal screeching against other bits of oiled metal, the treads of tanks, trucks, and all assortment of man-carrying machines. On this road in Svay Rieng province, or the Parrot's Beak, as it had become known to the Americans obsessing over what could possibly lay within its shape on a map, and many other roads up and down the border of the two countries, a similar scene played out. The dirt or mud roads or the highway became inundated by a force of more than 30,000 troops of the United States Armed Forces, and more than 40,000 of the South Vietnamese. A new front was being carved open in the Vietnam War, more than 30 kilometers deep into Cambodia. Now, as it turns out, the South Vietnamese had actually begun their assault of the sanctuaries a couple of days earlier than the Nixon announcement, and the thrust of their forces are coming along this band in Svay Rieng. For simplicity's sake, we can say in this wide band including the areas surrounding Route 1. which is that highway that connects Phnom Penh to Saigon. Okay, so we're looking at 2 months of this new front in the war, right? Well, that's for the Americans at least. And we will look at some parts of this campaign in detail. But let's just, big picture, consider this almost like a large-scale search and destroy mission. Lots of movement, lots of uncovering areas that the communists had been, securing their weapons and ammunition and supplies, basically disrupting what those sanctuaries were, right? Then alongside that, you have the need to actively relieve areas of the country that have been overtaken by the Viet Cong and battalions of the North Vietnamese. That involves large-scale battles, so in some ways this was similar to the way the war had been conducted in South Vietnam for some years, and in some ways it was quite a different experience for these South Vietnamese units. So some is still this, attacking guerrilla units, and some looking to isolate and destroy large camped-in forces. Some battles are quick, some take several hours, some take days. There's a lot of clearing villages, setting fire to houses suspected to be Viet Cong. There are a lot of scared local Cambodians, and there are some places where a gunshot or two will be returned fire with, a barrage of artillery or even airstrikes. A naval flotilla also travels up the Mekong from South Vietnam, clearing the river all the way up until Nek Long, which had been taken by the communists at this point. So a lot of this is about securing that big chunk of Cambodia southeast of Phnom Penh, and particularly that big zone that runs across to the border closest to Saigon. The South Vietnamese set up a base of operations at Nek Long, and they're going to, use that to supply and coordinate their activities in Cambodia from this point. So how does this all play out? Well, militarily, because there are some issues to do with the South Vietnamese troops' presence generally, which we will get into in a moment, but militarily, the first week, 2 weeks, the combined 70,000 or so troops encounter relatively little resistance. Various units report unearthing extensive enemy caches of weapons and food, but nothing that military commanders could describe as, the Viet Cong Pentagon, COSVN. So, it's quiet, a little too quiet. I forget exactly which news article it was, but you have this American soldier saying, it's a little spooky. You'll get to a village, there's no one there. Although, interestingly, there was one report where a Lieutenant General Davison, the commander of all the US troops in Cambodia for these 2 months, he said, "Yeah, I reckon we got part of it." Quote, "We know we got part of the COSVN post office. We read some of their mail. We think we got a piece of the finance and economy section. And we think we got a piece of the education and training section of the COSVN headquarters." End quote. Which is, hey, it's something, alright? Okay, but by the 9th of May, so just a little over a week into this incursion, according to official figures at the time, in the Fishhook operation, so Svai Rang pretty much, reports are of more than 1,300 enemy combatants killed, 38 Americans and 7 South Vietnamese. In the Parrot's Beak, further north, the death toll was supposedly 1,000 enemy soldiers killed, 8 Americans lost, and 113 South Vietnamese, as well as 8 helicopters during that time as well. But overall, in this, first week or two of the incursion, you can get a pretty good idea of what's happening here, with these massive amounts of troops coming across the border, and instead of the communist Vietnamese just digging in and saying, okay, here we are, here are our sanctuaries, and we're going to fight you from them, let's dig some trenches and exchange fire. No, that wouldn't be very clever. They more or less just retreat further into the country, almost becomes like a kind of race. Now, this will be something that comes up in literally every single source. It's one of the main takeaways of this whole operation. And we'll get to, the big outcomes and the historical significance sort of toward the end of the episode. But it's important to realize now that it is moving the communist Vietnamese further into the country, where, remember, there is still barely any retaliation that the Cambodian government army is going to be putting up there. And they're really focusing on securing Phnom Penh, like that's what the Cambodian government is mostly looking to do at this time. We know from the last episode they've already abandoned much of their military outpost in particularly the eastern provinces, in the northeast and in the east. Remember to visualize this, sort of take your right hand and with your thumb pointing left, make kind of a backwards C shape. And if you pop that over the map of Cambodia, with Phnom Penh and the areas out west and northwest of Battambang sort of clear, like the areas that aren't covered by your hand, that's still government control, and that C shape is sort of an indication of where the communists are making their advances. Now, recall what I just said, like every book, every source, everyone is basically in agreement of probably the one big effect that this incursion will have is that it's going to move the communist Vietnamese further into the country. Now, my main question to that, and again, I can't stress this enough, it is uncontested. No one says anything different about this. No one challenges it. And I'm not going to be stupid enough to challenge it either, I suppose. But I am going to look at what they're saying, and I guess, in my own mind, sort of, prove what everyone has said for the last 50 years on this specific issue. But while they all say that this outcome is that the Vietnamese troops moved further into Cambodia, the communists moved further in, my question to that is, well, weren't they already there prior to the incursion? That's what I don't really get. Like in the last episode, which is talking about sort of early April, we're already talking about the Vietnamese communist troops well into the country. We talked about the battle at Sang, which is only 15 miles from Phnom Penh. We were already talking about whole swaths of territory being lost to the communists. But I suppose the point is that they move more of their forces from the areas that had already been harassed, and they sort of move them further into the country. So I guess that is the main takeaway, that while you used to have tens of thousands of troops more along the border with Vietnam, now you've got tens of thousands of troops further in, not just, I suppose, these smaller units that were already making these big advances into Cambodia. And that's more or less done just to get those forces out of harm's way, really, sort of scatter them into the rest of the country to avoid a massive confrontation with this 70,000 odd troop movement coming from Vietnam. From what I can tell from going through day by day of the newspapers, it seems like things get more confrontational from about the 15th of May, so about a fortnight after the incursion began. And I believe that would probably be a mixture of things, like you can imagine those communist forces retreating west, but soon enough they are going to becoming sort of squished up on the boundaries of where they can go, and they will need to start hunkering down and encountering what was following them. Similarly, sporadic attacks seem to crop up back closer to the Vietnamese border, so sort of trying to outflank where this main thrust of the Americans and South Vietnamese were, and they're striking back at those bases to distract them and force them to sort of spread themselves back to where they came from. And speaking of these areas further inland, one of the areas that sees a lot of heavy fighting is in Kampong Cham province, and the town itself as well. So Kampong Cham is one of the largest cities in Cambodia. It's an important area to the northeast of Phnom Penh. It was only defended by about 1,000 Cambodian troops, and they were under a lot of strain when it was besieged, essentially, by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong from around the 12th of May. They shelled the city and were using snipers. The Kampong Cham airfield nearby was shelled day and night, rendered unusable. They also blocked access to the city via the Mekong River, so the city was isolated, and the understrength Cambodian troops weren't going to last very long. So to relieve this, 2 South Vietnamese units are sent there on the 23rd of May, and they're supported by US aircraft and gunships and advisors, and the South Vietnamese broke through. Now, key to this was the nearby Chup rubber plantation, which is absolutely huge, the biggest in the country. It's still there today, something like 60,000 acres. Might have been the biggest in Indochina back then, one news article said. I'm not too sure of that, but it's huge. So the communists are basically making a base in that rubber plantation, They've got anti-aircraft guns, everything. This is serious stuff. And a captured Viet Cong said that they probably had at least 2,000 men or more in there. Now, interestingly, the American troops can't engage in this battle. They have this 20-mile or 30-kilometer limit, and then they just have to stop. It's like a brick wall for them. But the South Vietnamese aren't subjected to that particular rule. The fighting goes on for a few days, the plantation gets hit with napalm, and there is a coordinated effort to break through via the Mekong River as this sort of pincer movement to wipe out resistance and relieve Kampong Cham from this siege. Interestingly, and it will come up during the Chen La operations as well, we'll get to them in a later episode, but the Chup plantation itself wasn't occupied subsequently, and it was just later retaken by the communists in June, and then I believe it was hit with B-52s from that point. But they will remain a significant force in this area, so it just gives you a kind of pretty good idea how big this rubber plantation is. Another interesting thing to come out of this battle for Kampong Cham is that the assault on the plantation is, well, I'll quote this article from the 24th of May, New York Times. A dozen men identified as members of the Khmer Rouge, a Cambodian communist guerrilla force, were reported killed on the plantation's southern edge, and 15 were reported captured. End quote. So yes, there's a little hint for you guys about who we will be looking to focus on in the next episodes, as the Khmer Rouge get a shout out and are actually involved in the fighting, even if it's in a very minor supportive role at this time. But if we stick to this first few weeks of the incursion, actually really the first few days, there is another really important theme that we need to be focusing on, and that has a lot to do with the first part of this two-parter. Those massacres of Vietnamese civilians in April have not been forgotten. This is a big feature of the reporting once the incursion began. For instance, on the 3rd of May, Gloria Emerson for The Times wrote that the South Vietnamese soldiers visiting the village of Prasat, you might recall, my dear listener, that this village was the setting of one of the first massacres of Vietnamese civilians the month before, when those that had been interred from the nearby town were ostensibly released because of an incoming Viet Cong attack, only to be gunned down. Subsequently, it was claimed that they died in a crossfire. 89 people were killed. Since then, the town had indeed been occupied by communist forces, but they had left before the chasing incursion caught up. Here are some quotes from Emerson's article. South Vietnamese troops who penetrated 19 miles inside Cambodia today stopped at Prasat, where Cambodian soldiers had killed Vietnamese civilians on April 10, and took a symbolic revenge. Now is the time for the killers to pay in blood, a South Vietnamese soldier wrote on the walls of a shattered store. Where were they killed? I would like to see the place, another Vietnamese soldier kept asking. Although the commander of the troops in the tactical zone directing the South Vietnamese operation denied that the soldiers had stopped at Prasat because of its emotional significance, the mood of his men belied it. The South Vietnamese infantrymen were not discouraged from writing anti-Cambodian slogans on the walls of buildings. End quote. She goes on to explain that the situation in Saigon regarding this incursion was tense, delicate. There were calls for action against the Cambodian government. Students were even demonstrating, asking for the South Vietnamese to declare war on Cambodia, let alone make use of their troops to help them from the communists. Anti-Cambodian sentiment was intense. Another article, a few days later, wrote about the tension between Cambodian government troops and South Vietnamese troops who were both in Svay Rieng. A high-ranking South Vietnamese soldier said to the reporter, quote, "Crazy Cambodians. Their army? Weak," with a shrug of the shoulders. "What army? It is an army of soldiers in despair." End quote. The article ends by also referencing events at Prasat. Quote, "Many of the Vietnamese soldiers have gone to see the site of the slaughter at the Big Tin building that used to be an agricultural cooperative. The fleeing relatives of victims had come back to burn the bodies, which had lain in the heat for days. "A man cannot really believe this," a Vietnamese said, gently pushing aside a blackened bone with his foot. "It is something we will never forget." End quote. So there is this real elephant in the room with this whole thing, and as we said in the last episode, it was just such a horrible thing to occur in the first place, let alone from a point where, after this, the Cambodian government was going to ask for assistance and need to get it from South Vietnam. This ugly circumstance was also mentioned in an official South Vietnamese military history of the incursion, and despite being a government-written military history, which are typically dry documents, it does necessarily speak of how this situation evolved. So, in reference to that operation to relieve Kampong Cham that we spoke about, the author, Brigadier General Tran Dinh To, relayed a message from President Thieu, made on the 11th, to the South Vietnamese armed forces in this incursion, or rather one group, saying, quote, "The general situation throughout Cambodia was becoming more serious with every passing day. Our residents in Phnom Penh were being badly mistreated by Khmer authorities and needed to be repatriated as soon as possible." End quote. In fact, there was a group of these Vietnamese that required asylum, and these troops would need to organise for Route 1 to be cleared so they could get them out of Cambodia. Now, that's a crazy situation, isn't it? Think about it. You've got Vietnamese troops in Cambodia fighting another Vietnamese army and trying to relieve the pressure that those communist Vietnamese troops are putting on Cambodia, as well as their own country. But at the same time, you've got the Cambodian government rounding up Vietnamese civilians and sometimes killing them. And the people trying to save the Cambodian government are themselves angry that their civilians have been getting killed. It is a strange, sad set of circumstances, and it's tense. In fact, the same military history source describes a situation that occurred on the 22nd of May. Quote, "A most regrettable incident, where a South Vietnamese jeep carrying a few guys, they're travelling on Route 1, which by this time had been cleared, but they were attacked. 2 of them wounded, the jeep was set on fire, one of the guys goes missing. And the commander, once he finds out, he thinks that it must have been Cambodian soldiers, government soldiers, doing this in retaliation for South Vietnamese conduct during the invasion so far. There was an investigation, and eventually it was decided that it was in fact Viet Cong, but the fact that he assumed that it was government Cambodian troops points to how tense things were. At the same time, the Cambodian newspapers are running stories alleging that the South Vietnamese were acting in really bad ways, ransacking Cambodian properties, treating the population badly. And you can imagine the reaction of the Vietnamese to that, right? These soldiers risking their lives, fighting in Cambodia, seeing the graves of those civilians who had been killed, and the press is complaining about their conduct? Well, maybe even a few of them might respond to that by saying, "Hey, I'll give you something to complain about," you know? In fact, even one of the lieutenants in charge was like, "This is an insult to our army." He orders an investigation, yes. He promises punishment, yes. But also says, look, if these stories aren't true, then hey, maybe we'll just pack up and go home, huh? Have fun saving Kampong Cham by yourselves. So, yeah, if there's an elephant in the room, it's bleeding. I don't know if that's a weird phrase. It is an image, though, right? So, moving on slightly, some of that tension dissipates with, well, more and more of the Vietnamese civilians being taken back for asylum. In Vietnam, for instance, there's also more international pressure for this to end. But at the end of May, meetings between Lon Nol, his brother Lon Non, and South Vietnamese officials lead to a re-establishment of diplomatic ties and a military assistance agreement being signed. So while it might just be papering over the cracks, at least it is organised on an official level. However, and this is sort of one of the long-term unintended consequences of the incursion, and I suppose one of the things that Lon Nol would have perhaps known about and wanted to avoid, but didn't really have a choice. After all, remember, he wasn't actually consulted about this. But recall, my dear listener, what was Lon Nol and Sirik Matak's main reason for getting rid of Sihanouk? We're going to get rid of the communist Vietnamese. We're getting them out of the country. Now, they had basically got a whole different problem now. Not only are the communists not out of the country, in fact, they are much more in the country than they were before the coup, but second to that, now you've got maybe 30,000 or more South Vietnamese troops who are going to stay on as well. And how true it may have been on the ground, whatever the reality of that, they do not have a good reputation. Basically, they will be seen as bandits in a lot of places. And I thought of this example a few days ago. I'm not quite sure how it'll work out, but I'm sure many of you have a sense of at least the stereotype of the American soldier in Vietnam, right? And put to the side, again, for the moment, just how real any of these may have been. But, we can all remember what happened at My Lai, but just all I want for you to do is to think about the stereotype. Literally just that, the image, meaning, feel free to just imagine one of the many dickheads that are depicted in any number of Vietnam War movies. That's the image, right? Someone reckless, scary, loose, callous, doesn't care about the locals, burning someone's house for fun, sexual assault, maybe even a murderer. Now, what I want you to realize is that for many of the Cambodians living in the rural areas, the ones that are now being in direct contact with the South Vietnamese troops, the way they think about those South Vietnamese troops is more or less the same kind of fear and resentment combined into that image that we might have of the stereotypical American soldier, even based on movies and pop culture. Regardless of how many people actually fit that description, it's the idea which is just as powerful. That's how many Cambodians saw the threat of these troops, in the same kind of way. Conversely, one of the really clever and politically savvy things that the Vietnamese communists will do, or had been doing, and the Khmer Rouge are learning from this, and at least initially will emulate, is that they were instructed to be very mindful of the Khmer customs, their lives. They're told not to run amok, not to steal, to pay for things if they are necessary to take. Now, I'm sure a great many of those local Khmers still harboured a lot of resentment against these communist Vietnamese as well. After all, you've got that dynamic between the two peoples generally. But there will be a stark difference in the reputation that each faction earns during this period. Now, on a similar note, Lon Nol, on this larger scale, he now can't turn around and say, hey, Sihanouk is siding with the Vietnamese. He's a traitor. Because guess what? People can now use that argument against you. And in terms of recruitment for the communists, well, they can say, look, you've got this corrupt leader, he's inviting these terrible South Vietnamese soldiers in, and they burned down your house. They stole your chickens and shot your buffalo. Also, remember the king? You love him, right? Well, come fight to get him back to power. They don't even have to mention communism at this point, but if they did, you know what they would say? Aren't you sick of being a poor farmer? And some rich guy in Phnom Penh takes all of your taxes? Well, fight for us, fight for the king, and we will all be equal. No more taxes. That's a hell of a message. And as you know, that message will only get more effective if you're talking to someone that not only had their chickens stolen by some South Vietnamese soldiers, but had their entire farm, village, potentially even family, killed overnight in a B-52 raid that was supposed to hit some guerrillas who were hiding out a couple of miles away. Then that message is very clear. And this is perhaps the Achilles heel of the entire, the whole damn Vietnam War, right? It was a misreading of the conditions on the ground, a lack of understanding of the culture and history of the region, and presuming that military might and the brand of freedom and democracy will do the rest. It was just never that simple, not from the start, And while we've talked about the catch-22 that this Cambodian incursion was, and look, very few of us actually know what we're talking about when it comes to the physical and psychological reality of war, but speaking on this aspect of this part of the history, in April, May, June 1970, this Cambodian-Vietnamese enmity angle was another aspect that seemed to have been ignored by the decision-makers in Washington. Strangely, if it was just the Americans that had done the incursion, then it would have probably been a lot more welcome. And speaking of the Americans, there was a great article in the New York Times that I found when I was going through this 2-month thing, basically day by day, and it was from the 24th of May, and it was a special by James P. Sturber, who I must admit I had not heard of before this, and he wrote this really interesting piece as a result of being very close to the American soldiers on this incursion up until that point. It was titled for GI, It's War as Usual in Cambodia. And I just want to walk through it a bit because it gives this human side to this contingent of the war as well. Like, most of these guys have been drafted in. They aren't wondering whether Nixon made the right decision or not. They're just thinking, am I going to live through this? That was their reason to say, no, the whole war's crazy. I'm going to read out a fair bit because I think it's a brilliant piece. Quote, "What they were trying to say," an army psychiatrist commented later, "was that they were scared. Hours and days later, when they heard on their portable radios in the Cambodian jungles that young men of their age in America were outraged and that bullets were flying at some of their alma maters, some responded with one of those universal grunt expressions that cover everything from a commander's order to the sight of a dead soldier. There it is. Any one of them would have gladly traded the compulsory violence of Vietnam and Cambodia for the elective violence of America. They did not choose this violence. They were chosen for it. They were aware of the 4 dead at Kent State, but they were more aware of the dead and wounded in their own company. For the grunt, or foot soldier, the boundaries of national geography are far less important than the boundaries of time. By far the most positive thought a soldier on the battlefield has is that he will go home at the end of the year, if he makes it. After a few days, the war in Cambodia took on the appearance of the war in Vietnam. Just as the elephants in War Zone C and northern Bin Long and Phuc Long provinces had been killed by helicopter gunners because they were labouring for the Viet Cong, so were the water buffalo in some parts of Cambodia gunned down for their circumstantial affiliations. Just as some companies of grunts went out of their way to befriend frightened civilians in South Vietnam, so did these troops send their medics to Cambodian villages to treat infections and distribute captured rice. Just as tank troopers of the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment befriend stray dogs in the jungles of South Vietnam, so did they carefully gather baby chickens and even baby pigs from the battlefields and offer them the relative security of a flak jacket nest in the bowels of their rumbling tanks. And just as a few grunts, with whatever compassion they still had, shook their heads at the discovery of a wounded South Vietnamese child, so did they unsuccessfully fight back tears at the sight of a tiny dead girl with her arm blown off in the ruins of Sihanouk. There were scenes that were hard to believe. The grunts who had been through frightening enemy attacks in which they were sure they would all die would look at you later, fumbling for words, and finally say, "It was just like in the movies." On the southern edge of the Sihanouk airfield, and I should say Sihanouk is a district of Kracher province in Cambodia's east. On the southern edge of Sihanouk airfield, a North Vietnamese soldier had been talked out of his hole, where he had been shooting at helicopters with a .51 caliber machine gun. A Viet Cong defector who was working with the Americans was slapping him in the face, when another North Vietnamese soldier, entrenched in a nearby hole, tossed out a grenade, wounding 6 Americans, including a regimental commander. Kill him! Shouted a sergeant who, tears in his eyes and shaking with rage, ran toward the prisoner and began kicking him in the groin. a grunt tossed a grenade in the other enemy soldier's hole. He was dragged out, an arm and a leg missing, but still alive. 15 minutes later, he died as an army medic aboard a helicopter being shot at by other North Vietnamese, breathed into his lungs to try and save him. Specialist 4, Raymond Roxby, a 19-year-old draftee from Scranton, Pennsylvania, had been fighting in Cambodia for 4 days when he was hit in the back by fragments from an American howitzer shell that had exploded too close. He was the 20th man in his company wounded in Cambodia. One had been killed. He sat up in bed at the 45th Surgical Hospital and smoked a cigarette. I guess it's a good idea to get all those supplies and stuff, but nobody wanted to go over there, he said. End quote. So there's more to that article, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, but it's really great for me for a few reasons. Firstly, you can tell it's written right there on the front line, right there at the time. And because of that, it cuts through so much of the noise that has been created by the rest of history that followed it. The fact that it had any kind of nuance, I think, is quite rare when so much hindsight now prevents people from exploring this topic from different perspectives. And I think so much of it is summed up by that last line from the young, so young, guy. There's a famous Australian song written about Vietnam called I Was Only 19, and this kid, Raymond Roxby, 19 years old, he's saying, yeah, of course we didn't want to go, but also, all of those supplies and the sanctuaries and everything, what are we supposed to do? And that is, isn't that just this whole incursion or invasion in a nutshell? Do we want to go in? No. Did we feel that we had to? Yes. Now, if we continue into June, toward the end of at least the American time limit, a picture began to come into focus of what the incursion had achieved or what it hadn't. And there was plenty of fighting, plenty of supplies secured, things like that. We'll get to this overall picture with another Nixon speech in a moment. But given my interest in providing a balanced picture here, I wanted to touch on some of the more callous aspects of this fighting of the war in Cambodia during this 2-month period as well. There are some other indiscriminate killings that seem to be a hallmark of parts of the fighting in Vietnam, and they crossed the border quite literally. Some formally classified documents seem to point to a helicopter attack on a Cambodian village at Srey Kandal, where helicopters circled the villagers, got scared, ran, and were fired upon, and that a hooch was set on fire that killed at least one person and wounded others. This was reported by refugees from that village to other US soldiers at a later date, and that this happened on the 3rd of May. A similar incident was reported in the village of Marouan, where on the morning of the 1st of May, helicopters circled in a similar fashion, and perhaps 12 people were killed and 5 wounded. These instances that occurred during the incursion, I think, fall into a wider picture of, particularly this border area where basically it had become a bit of a free fire zone, hadn't it? And coming under the consideration as just being an area where the enemy was using it or was hiding in it, and perhaps in a similar way to how that callousness built up, and you have these simply awful circumstances where innocent people who would have lived in a village for generations will be wiped out simply because of their proximity to this war and being sucked right into it. And all because of these mundane issues like supply lines and sanctuaries. And again, we're not quite talking about the bombing here, but that will be more of an issue in the next few years. But yes, the Americans announced that they are leaving at the end of June, but Lon Nol will beg that they don't. But if he doesn't get troops, what can he ask for? He asks for them to continue the bombing, because he thinks that's at least something that will help his side. Now, we're going to return to that in later episodes, but for now, let's look to wrap up this incursion through late June 1970. So the withdrawal of the US troops was completed at 6 p.m. on June 30th, right on the deadline that had been set by Nixon. One of the last units to get back into South Vietnam was led by a General Casey, who was quoted saying, "We certainly appreciated the opportunity to get into the sanctuaries. I've done 2 tours over here faced with the sanctuaries problem, and it was an opportunity we thought we'd never have. He's basically just talking about the huge numbers of munitions, supplies and food that they're able to recover or destroy in Cambodia, and of course this means that the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese can't use it. Military spokesman said that the total number of American casualties in the Cambodian operation were more than 300 killed and more than 1,500 wounded. Cosvin was, as was predicted, not found, as the various mobile elements that it consisted of had been moved to a new site near Kratchir City, where Pol Pot would soon join them to oversee the new war that he was going to be much more involved in. And this is how Nixon will characterize the success of the incursion in our third and final speech of this little two-parter. It was on the 3rd of June, so it still had a month to go, but this is what he had to say to the American people.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. 1 month ago, I announced the decision ordering American participation with South Vietnamese forces in a series of operations against communist-occupied areas in Cambodia, which have been used for 5 years as bases for attacks on our forces in South Vietnam. This past weekend in the Western Whitehouse in California, I met with Secretary Laird, General Abrams, and other senior advisors to receive a first-hand report on the progress of this operation. Based on General Abrams' report, I can now state that this has been the most successful operation of this long and very difficult war. The only remaining American activity in Cambodia after July 1st will be air missions to interdict the movement of enemy troops and material where I find that is necessary to protect the lives and security of our men in South Vietnam. Our discussions with the South Vietnamese government indicate that their primary objective remains the security of South Vietnam, and that their activity in Cambodia in the future, after their withdrawal from the sanctuaries, will be determined by the actions of the enemy in Cambodia. When this operation was announced, the critics charged that it would increase American casualties, that it would widen the war, that it would lengthen our involvement, that it might postpone troop withdrawals. But the operation was undertaken for precisely the opposite reasons, and it has had precisely the opposite effect. As long as the war goes on, we can expect some setbacks and some reversals. But following the success of this effort, we can say now with confidence that we will keep our timetable for troop withdrawals. There is one commitment yet to be fulfilled. I pledge to end this war, and I shall keep that promise. But I am determined to end the war in a way that will promote peace rather than conflict throughout the world. I am determined to end it in a way that will bring an era of reconciliation to our people and not an era of furious recrimination. In seeking peace, let us remember that at this time, only this administration can end this war and bring peace. We have a program for peace, and the greater the support the administration receives in its efforts, the greater the opportunity to win that just peace we all desire. Peace is the goal that unites us. Peace is the goal toward which we are working. And peace is the goal this government will pursue until the day we reach it. Thank you and good night.
So, a lot of talk about peace and a lot of talk about success. And look, while he didn't say we didn't get Cosvin like I said I would, he did say that they had some aims and that they basically achieved them. Now, on that front, again, just like the initial speech, he's not entirely wrong. Although peace wasn't coming that soon for, say, the Cambodians themselves. It was going to buy the South Vietnamese more time. It did put a serious dent in communist logistics and supplies, with some estimates that almost half of the stockpile in Cambodia was captured or destroyed. Documents were captured, including plans for the defeat of the Lon Nol government, by the way. And as Wilfred Diak stated, quote, there was little question that the communist offensive capability had been blunted, gaining time for Cambodia, Vietnamization, and although Hanoi didn't intend to interfere, America's departure. End quote. As we said before, as was usually the case with the American war in Vietnam, and now this spillover into Cambodia, short-term thinking prevailed. And the long-term, well, America wasn't going to be there in the long term. So that was somewhat disregarded. This incursion had proved that America was desperate to end the war without knowing how. And yes, the incursion had some short-term gains, but the long-term stuff, not so good. In essence, if we're talking about the Cambodian side of this, it's going to buy them time. Same with the South Vietnamese too. But just a few more years. Well, 5 years, to be precise. And we've already spoken about some of the outcomes so far, like Lon Nol thinks that now the US is going to have their back, fully. Lon Nol will think of Nixon as a personal friend. They woefully misjudge the level of interest and commitment the US is going to provide, although financially and militarily, in terms of aid, in terms of what's coming in, that tap that they've been hoping for is fully turned on. The Cambodian army will go from about 30,000 to 150,000 very quick. But all that money being dumped on a country that wasn't known for its transparent, efficient, ethical business practices, well, we'll see where a lot of that aid ends up going. But there will be no more US troops, just US bombs, and we will see how that works out as well. Another outcome, as we said, now Lon Nol can't call Sihanouk a puppet of the Vietnamese. They themselves are getting a lot of support from the South Vietnamese, and this is uncomfortable for a lot of Cambodians. And now they feel that they're also going to be in a civil war, much more than a few months prior. Although it's arguable that many felt they were already in a civil war, as long ago as 1967, during events like the Sam Laut Rebellion. By the same token, as I explained, the main takeaway in all of the sources is that the sanctuaries of communist Vietnamese have been pushed inward into Cambodia, exposing more of the country to this fighting. And I guess my little addition that I want to add to that, to be clear, the fighting itself was already very far into Cambodia, before the incursion. But now a real bulk of the communist Vietnamese had moved further in. Now this is also going to relate to bombings, where once they had just been on that eastern border, well now the targets are all over Cambodia. For Nixon, well, he and Kissinger faced a real outcry across America and the world for what was seen as violating the territory of Cambodia. But as Diak points out, this was a little one-sided. People tended to ignore the fact that the Vietnamese communists had made a mockery of the national boundaries in Indochina for decades. But Nixon will also face opposition from different sectors at home. We already touched on the anti-war demonstrations, particularly the tragedy at Kent State. There's also a march on Washington. But importantly for the war and Cambodia, it will also lead to congressional restrictions on future activities. The Senate's Cooper Church Amendment prohibited the use of funds for US personnel in Cambodia, basically meaning they couldn't even really have military advisors in Cambodia or engage in any combat activity in support of Cambodian forces. I think one of the sources said this was the first time that Congress had ever sort of restricted a war effort, and essentially this barred the possibility that had occurred in the early 60s when the military advisors sent under Kennedy had ended up just, being in the war in Vietnam. That's not going to happen again. It was a real signal to how adversarial the Congress would be to the Nixon Whitehouse, and that's going to continue and have its own repercussions. So, what I hope that you, my dear listener, have learned from these last 2 episodes is that this very infamous part of the Vietnam War is more complex than it's usually talked about. The incursion's purpose was to prevent the fall of the Lon Nol government and provide better conditions for South Vietnam so that America could continue Vietnamization of the war and get out. That is, in effect, what they did. However, we must weigh up the intent with the unintended consequences, and I will leave that largely up to you. For the historian's opinion, I think Craig Etchison expertly points out in Rise and Demise of Democratic Kampuchea, quote, "There were some unanticipated and unintended consequences, but that it nearly led to the political destruction of its authors does not detract from the tactical achievement," end quote. So he's talking, the political destruction of its authors is, Nixon and Kissinger. And we should include the bombings within this element of the incursion as well, because, I've lost count of how many times I see this lazy assertion come up on news articles or online or, yes, in history books, that either the border area secret bombing or the later carpet bombing or the incursion itself in some way created the Khmer Rouge, or predominantly paved their way to power. Things don't quite work in that black and white way, I'm afraid, in this instance. I touched on this a few episodes ago, so I won't go into the same detail again, but I was happy to find this rereading Etchison's book. I realized he has this whole section on this topic that I had forgotten or not managed to read, and I was really happy to see that it kind of resonated with my own thoughts on the subject, in particular when viewed against a book like Shawcross's Sideshow, which we touched on in the first part of this 2-part episode. A great book, but it does have a thesis that it really seeks to prove, and in doing so it ignores certain things. It waters down evidence to the contrary of that thesis, and to a large extent minimizes the existing conditions prior to the period examined in the subtitle of the book, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia. And look, I'm very wary of sort of wrapping this episode up with all of the big themes we've talked about and trying to land on one side or another of this topic. So I do feel like we've given a lot of time to everyone's perspective here, and there is plenty of room to blame. Like I said, blame the Americans, blame the Vietnamese, blame the Chinese, blame the French, but don't also forget to blame the Cambodians too. As Etchison says, they have a large part to play in the near demise of their country as well. And yes, the Cambodians were of little significance to Nixon and Kissinger, no doubt, but also to North Vietnam and South Vietnam. You might even say that a great number of Cambodian civilians were of little significance to the Cambodian leaders themselves. But the Khmer Rouge very much existed before the incursion, they existed before the bombing, and conditions in the country had for a long time looked like they would lead to a fire breaking out, before Nixon or Kissinger was in office. And when we look at the sequence of events here, it was the North Vietnamese that were taking the Khmer Rouge under their wing, training their new army, and importantly, conquering much of Cambodian territory before the incursion had even begun. Actions that were taken to defend their own interests, not Cambodian ones. And in large part, this brought the incursion into Cambodia. And you know who they are going to hand over the administration of that territory to? Yes, the Khmer Rouge, whose army will grow from just a few thousand to more than 10 times that in very little time. And that's where we will begin our next episode, as the leaders of the Cambodian communists struggle in this new ascendant position, almost worrying that they have been given too much of the country to administer so quickly. They will have to begrudgingly allow for their so-called comrades to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them. Even the area around Angkor will be captured by the communists, but they'll need it to be administered by the Vietnamese. You can imagine how irksome that would be for them. But in the next episode, we're going to see how they have the chance to impart their revolutionary society on vast areas of Cambodia that fall under their control. And, quickly, you will already see these conditions in vast areas of Cambodia well before that final conquering of Phnom Penh. Liberated areas will see what democratic Kampuchea is going to be like. You'll even see the prototype of S-21 soon in operation. So until next time, goodbye. Oh, and I should say, very necessary for me to say thank you so much to everyone who heard me in the last episode, who has helped out the show It means so much to me. Thank you, each and every one of you. Head to www.shadowsofutopia.com/support for more information on how you can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Thank you again.